They found her on the floor of a mission house in northern India, barely breathing, her body so ravaged by fever that the doctor who examined her said there was nothing left to save. He was a trained man, a careful man. He had seen enough death to know what it looked like before it arrived. He was right about almost everything. He was wrong about Minnie Abrams. Picture this. It is 1887. A young woman from rural Ontario steps off a boat in Bombay carrying 2 dresses, a King James Bible with a cracked spine, and a conviction so absolute it bordered on recklessness. She is 23 years old. She has never been to Asia. She speaks no Hindi, no Marathi, no Gujarati. She has no organization behind her, no mission board with a monthly stipend, no returning veteran to show her the ropes. What she has is a letter of introduction to a woman named Pandita Ramabai, and a belief, stubborn and unshakable as bedrock, that God had put her on that boat for a reason she did not yet fully understand. Have you ever felt called to something that made no logical sense? Have you ever followed a voice into a place where nothing about your preparation matched the size of what you were walking into? That is where Minnie Abrams begins. She was born in 1859 in Portage, Wisconsin, the 4th of 7 children in a family that moved often and prayed always. Her father, a Methodist minister named Hiram Abrams, took his family wherever the work led him. Small towns, cold churches, communities where faith was less a comfort than a requirement for survival. Minnie grew up watching her mother, a quiet and immovable woman, stretch a modest income across 7 children without complaint. She never heard her mother panic. She heard her pray instead. There was something forged in that, something that could not be bought or borrowed. By the time the family settled in Illinois, Minnie had developed a particular sharpness of mind. She read voraciously, theology, history, biography, anything she could find. She had opinions about Scripture that surprised the men at her father's church. She asked questions that made people shift in their seats. She was not confrontational about it. She was just honest, and sometimes honesty is the more disruptive thing. She enrolled at the Chicago Training School for City, Home and Foreign Missions, a place that was, even by the standards of the 1880s, unusual. It trained women for ministry work. It treated their calling as legitimate. For Minnie, walking through those doors must have felt like the first time a room had been built around the exact shape of who she already was. But even then, she did not know where she was going. The answer came through a pamphlet, a small hand-typed document about the work of Pandita Ramabai in India, a high-caste Hindu widow who had converted to Christianity and was building a home for child widows in Pune. The details were stark. Girls as young as 8, widowed before they had understood what marriage was, cast out by their husbands' families, often starving, sometimes trafficked. The numbers were staggering. The need was a wound in the earth. Minnie read it once. Then she read it again. Then she applied. She arrived in Bombay in 1887 and made her way to Pune, where Ramabai's Sharada Sadan, the home of wisdom, was already taking in its first residents. The work was harder than anything the pamphlet had described. The girls arrived malnourished, mistrustful, sometimes violent from trauma they had no words for. The social opposition was fierce. Orthodox Hindu families organized against Ramabai, accusing her of converting girls under false pretenses. Funding dried up, staff came and left. The Indian climate was not gentle with foreign bodies. Minnie got sick, often. The fever that nearly killed her came in her first year, and it was not the last time illness would bring her to the edge of what she could endure. She recovered slowly, went back to work, got sick again. This was not a triumphant season. There were no thousands filling any field. There was laundry and lesson plans, and letters home asking for more prayer and more money, usually in that order. She taught English, she organized classes, she learned enough Marathi to be useful, then enough to be fluent. She did the work that was in front of her, even when the work felt embarrassingly small compared to what she had imagined when she was back in Chicago reading pamphlets. There is a particular suffering in showing up fully and finding that the room is still nearly empty. Not because you did something wrong, simply because the time had not yet come. Minnie Abrams understood that suffering before she understood much else. She returned to North America twice for health reasons, each time uncertain whether she would go back, each time finding that she could not stay. There is a phrase that shows up in the letters she wrote during those years to friends, to supporters, to her sisters in Illinois. She used it so often, it began to sound like a compass bearing rather than a sentence. He is not finished. Not with India. Not with the work. Not, she seemed to be suggesting to herself as much as anyone else. With her. She went back. By the late 1890s, Ramabai's work had grown considerably. The Sharada Sadan had become the Mukti mission. Mukti meaning salvation or liberation in Sanskrit, a sprawling compound in Kedgan, a small town near Pune, that housed hundreds of girls and women. Famines had swept across the Deccan Plateau in 1896, and again in 1899, and Ramabai had opened her gates to whoever arrived at them. The numbers were overwhelming. At the peak, more than 2,000 women and children lived within those walls. Minnie was there for all of it. She organized relief caravans. She helped design the curriculum for the girls' school. She managed correspondence in 3 languages. She trained local women as teachers and caregivers so that the mission would not collapse if the foreign workers left. She built something durable, even when durable was invisible from the outside, but she was still, in many ways, unknown. Her name did not appear in the mission reports alongside Ramabai's. She did not give speeches at conventions in Toronto or London. When donors sent letters of inquiry about the work, they addressed them to Ramabai. When journalists wrote about Mukti, they wrote about Ramabai. Minnie wrote back to the donors. She handled the logistics. She stayed. And then in June of 1905, something happened that no one had prepared for, and no curriculum had described. It began with prayer. Ramabai had been reading accounts of revival in Wales. The Great Awakening that had swept through the mining communities there in 1904, where a young man named Evan Roberts had begun praying with small groups, and the meetings had grown until they could not be contained by any building. Wales had. She shared what she was reading with Minnie. Both women felt something they could not precisely name, a hunger, or an anticipation, or a sense that God was doing something in the world, and the question was only whether they would be present for it. Ramabai organized the Mukti girls into prayer groups. Minnie helped lead them. They prayed early in the morning before the day's work began. They prayed in the evenings. They confessed things they had never spoken aloud. They wept without entirely knowing why. On June 29, 1905, a group of girls was praying together in one of the mission's buildings when something shifted in the room. There is no clinical language for what happened next. Those who were present described it differently. Some said fire appeared on the heads of several girls. Some said the room filled with light that had no visible source. All of them said the praying changed, became something less like asking and more like arriving, like reaching a destination they had not known they were traveling toward. The news spread through the compound, then beyond it. Word reached Pune, then Bombay, then Calcutta. Missionaries from other stations came to see for themselves. Letters went out to mission headquarters in England, in America, in Canada. Reports were cautious at first, then increasingly urgent. Something was happening at Mukti that did not fit the existing categories. The prayer meetings continued. They grew. Women and girls who had arrived at the mission as refugees from famine, who had never encountered any religion but the one they were born into, began praying with the same intensity as those who had been there for years. There were healings reported. There were conversions that required no persuasion, only presence. Within weeks, what had started as a morning prayer gathering had become something that historians would later call the Mukti Revival, one of the earliest documented outpourings of the modern Pentecostal movement, happening not in a grand cathedral or a famous city, but in a compound in rural Maharashtra, among a community of widows and orphans and dispossessed women who had come there because they had nowhere else to go. Minnie Abrams wrote all of it down. She had always been a careful observer, and now she became a chronicler. She interviewed the girls who had been present in that first meeting. She documented what she saw and what she could not explain. She was honest about both. Her account, which she eventually compiled into a small book called The Baptism of the Holy Spirit and Fire, became one of the primary sources through which the Mukti revival spread to the wider world. That book made its way to a young missionary couple in Chile named Willis and May Hoover. They read it. They prayed about it. They began to pursue the same thing in their own congregation in Valparaiso. What happened there in 1909 became the seed of the Chilean Pentecostal movement, a movement that today encompasses millions of people across South America. A woman no one had heard of wrote a small book in rural India, and it set a continent on fire. But we are getting ahead of ourselves because Minnie Abrams did not know any of that yet. In 1907, she left Mukti and returned to North America. She was nearly 50 years old. She had spent 20 years in India. Her health was compromised in ways that would never fully reverse. She had no pension. She had no home of her own. She carried one trunk of belongings and whatever was left of the name she had built among the communities she had served. She began speaking at churches and conferences across the United States and Canada. She talked about what she had witnessed at Mukti. She talked about prayer and revival and the kind of transformation that starts small and then cannot be contained. The audiences were not always large, but they were always attentive. Something in the way she spoke made people quiet. She did not perform. She did not embellish. She simply described, in the careful and precise language of someone who had been present, what she had seen. And because she had spent 2 decades learning to do hard things without an audience, there was a quality in her that the audience could feel, a lack of need for them that made them lean in. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was trying to tell the truth. That is a rarer combination than it sounds. She went back to India in 1908. There was more work. There was always more work. The Mukti mission had continued to grow and evolve, and Minnie returned to it as she had returned to everything in her life, without fanfare, without a proper reception, simply showing up and picking up what had been set down. She began working specifically with young Indian women who felt called to ministry, training them, mentoring them, creating pathways for women's leadership inside the mission that would outlast any individual. She understood, in a way that was ahead of her time, that the work would only become self-sustaining if the people doing it were not foreigners. The goal was never to be needed indefinitely. The goal was to build something that would stand without her. This is a quiet kind of ambition. It does not make for dramatic stories at the time, but it is the ambition that produces things that last. In 1912, she published a small guide for training Indian Bible women. Local women who would go village to village, reaching communities that had no access to formal missions or institutional church structures. The guide was practical. It addressed how to approach different caste communities, how to handle opposition, how to establish trust before attempting anything else. It read like something written by someone who had made every possible mistake and was trying to save others the cost. She had made every possible mistake. She was trying. Her health broke again in 1913. The fevers returned with a severity that left her bedridden for weeks at a time. Friends urged her to return to North America permanently. She was 54 years old. She had given India more than a quarter-century of her life, most of it in conditions that were genuinely dangerous for a foreign woman's body. She stayed, not out of stubbornness exactly, or not only. There was something she had understood by then about the nature of the work she was in. That you do not choose when it is finished. You simply remain available until it is, and she was still available. She spent the last years of her life increasingly frail, increasingly confined to the compound, but still present in the way that matters. She prayed with the young women she had trained. She wrote letters. She kept records. She remained, in the most literal sense, a witness. On July 10, 1912, and here the historical record carries a quiet grace. She died at Kedgan, at the Mukti mission, surrounded by the women she had come to serve and by the work she had spent her life building. She died where she had chosen to be. That is not nothing. In a life full of invisible sacrifices, dying in the right place is its own kind of testimony. The story of what she left behind takes longer to tell than the story of her life. The book she wrote about the Mukti revival circulated through missionary networks for decades. It shaped how early Pentecostal communities understood revival, not as a scheduled event or a human production, but as something that arrives when people have been genuinely prepared to receive it. Her account of the Mukti prayer meetings influenced the theology of prayer circles that spread across Africa, Latin America, and Asia throughout the 20th century. The Indian Bible women she trained and the systems she built did not collapse when she died. They continued. Some of those women trained others, who trained others, in a chain of transmission that historians rarely trace back to Minnie Abrams, because historians rarely trace things back to women who were not the primary figure in the room. But the women knew. The Chilean revival that Willis and May Hoover sparked in 1909, the one seeded by her book, grew into movements that today include millions of Pentecostal believers across South America. Scholars of global Christianity have traced the theological DNA of those movements back to Mukti, and from Mukti back to the prayer gatherings that Minnie helped organize in June of 1905. She would have found this astonishing and unsurprising in equal measure. Astonishing, because nothing in that first year in Bombay, sick and disoriented and carrying 2 dresses and a cracked Bible, suggested that any of it was possible. Unsurprising, because she had believed from the beginning that God was in the business of using people the world had not noticed. She was very good at believing things before they were visible. There is a particular kind of person the world does not celebrate well. Not in real time anyway. The world celebrates the person who stands on the stage before the millions, whose name appears in the headline, whose story has a clear and dramatic arc that can be summarized in a sentence. We know how to make icons out of those people. We build museums for them. We are less practiced at honoring the ones who spent 25 years in a room that nobody photographed, building a thing that would not pay dividends until after they were gone. We do not know quite what to do with the quiet ones, the ones who had every opportunity to make the work about themselves and simply did not. Minnie Abrams did not become famous. By almost any external measure, she failed to achieve the kind of recognition that her work warranted during her lifetime. She was not invited to speak at the largest conferences. Her name did not become a household word in the Canadian churches that supported missions like hers. She died in a compound in rural India, and her death was noted in a handful of missionary newsletters. But she is part of why several 100 million people worship the way they worship today. The arithmetic of faithfulness does not always resolve itself on a human timeline. Sometimes the numbers only add up a century later, when someone takes the trouble to trace the line back from the fruit to the root. Minnie Abrams is a root. We tell these stories at Gathering of Souls because we believe that the people who changed the world were not always the ones who appeared to be changing it. Sometimes the person at the center of the frame is not where the real action was. Sometimes the real action was happening in a room just off frame, where someone was praying, or writing, or training, or simply staying when every reasonable voice was suggesting they leave. If you have been in that room, if you are in that room right now, we want you to hear this clearly. The room is not empty because you have failed. Sometimes the room is empty because you are early, because the season that is coming has not yet arrived and you are part of what prepares it. Because the work God puts in someone's hands is rarely the work that makes the news, and almost always the work that makes the news possible. Minnie Abrams knelt and prayed in the dark for 25 years. She trained women nobody photographed. She wrote a book that nobody famous endorsed, and that made its way anyway, quietly, across 2 oceans, and set things in motion that are still moving. He was not finished with her. He is looking for the available. He is looking for the ones who will remain in the room. Lord, what do you want me to do today for the harvest? That question has its own kind of gravity. It pulls toward places most people are not looking, toward work most people will not see, toward a life that will not be summarized easily on any stage. And yet, Minnie Abrams asked it, in a mission house in Maharashtra, in the small hours of a morning more than a century ago. And somewhere in South America right now, there is a congregation singing because she did.